investigative journalism is evolving,
expanding into new territories and finding new allies and intermediaries.
Between new facilities for online leaks, the deployment of intelligence tools, and an innovative cadre of freelancers in the field, a new kind of collective intelligence has emerged, stretching across national and disciplinary borders.
But as these changes take place, authorities are taking advantage of our organizational disarray by cracking down.
Public interest investigative reporting is now on the front line.
From heavy-handed searches of our offices to draconian regimes of electronic surveillance, we are seeing the wholesale persecution of technologists, journalists, sources, and whistleblowers.
Amid sophisticated new kinds of threats, how do we best challenge power?
How do we build international alliances against the encroachment of surveillance and censorship?
And how can we take advantage of this new collective intelligence?
Welcome to Follow the Data, Corruption, Leaks, and People versus Power. I am Tatiana Bazzichelli, the director of the Disruption Network Club, and I'm very happy to be part of the CIJ Logan Symposium with a great group of people that I'm going to present in a bit. First, I would like to say that this production is made also thanks to the Disruption Network Club. We are an organization based in Berlin, and we work also with social justice, whistleblowing, hacking. So I am happy to introduce the speaker that we are together with, Natalie Sedletska. She is an investigative reporter and a TV host based in Ukraine. Denis Jaromil Roio is a software artisan and ethical hacker living between the Netherlands and Italy. And we have Friedrich Lindenberg. He's based in Berlin, but he works globally as the data team lead of the OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. This event of today wants to reflect on the main question of the Logan Symposium that deals with the collective intelligence, investigative journalism, and the idea of development of technology. And in particular, we want to analyze how collective strategies reconfigure investigation, and also especially how this is possible in the act of denouncing corruption. And we are going to analyze two different perspectives in this panel. From one side, we want to understand the methods of making leaks accessible to a larger public. From the other side, instead, we want to understand how to do this in the context of anti-corruption, when especially we are working with sensitive data that not always should be disclosed. And we have to understand also how it's possible to inform the public correctly. So we are starting with the first presentation. I'm very happy to welcome our first speaker, Natalie Sedleska. She is the author and editor of the investigative TV program Schemes, Corruption in Detail at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So I leave the floor to you, Natalie, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Tatiana, and greetings to all. Thanks for inviting. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to talk about this, one of the most interesting experiences in my journalistic life. It's about Yanukovych leaks, a project that is about many things at once. For example, it's about the dreamed access for reporters, physical access to one of the most secret corruption objects in the country. It's also about how journalists from very different newsrooms within one country united around one archive. This is a unique collaboration of competitors in practice, which was possible because of the historical moment, I think. But it's also about how cooperation with programmers and volunteers made it possible for larger society to access one of the largest leaks on a national scale, the documents that the dictator wanted to destroy before he was fleeing the country. So let's take a closer look. Here is Viktor Yanukovych. Now he is ex-president of Ukraine. And here is the revolution of dignity in the cold winter of 2013 in Kiev, which changed the course of history in our country. People protested against the pro-Russian course chosen by the president and against the enormous corruption into which he plunged the country. The Ukrainian people learned about these numerous corruption schemes organized by Yanukovych associates from investigative journalists who work for very few free media at that time. For example, I worked on a small cable television channel, and in my program, I also talked about huge closed mansion, a residence in a large territory the size of Monaco, which has been illegally taken out of public ownership and where President Viktor Yanukovych settled himself. The complex is called Mezhigirya, and here is the picture of this secret object. Moreover, the staff of the residence had to hand over their cell phones at the entrance so that no photo or video evidence of the immense luxury inside of the presidential house would appear publicly, like this, for example. And now 3 long months of revolutionary confrontations and Yanukovych surrenders. This is a photo from his surveillance cameras from his residence. He is fleeing the country by helicopter in a hurry, trying to take at least some valuables with him. But the next day, his closed residence will be open to all Ukrainians. When leaving, Yanukovych ordered to destroy the documents that were preserved in Mezhigirya. And his staff tried to burn it at the beginning, but then they just threw them into a lake in the compound. And so they were found by activists who were the first to come home to Yanukovych after he left the country. Everything that came next was an example of the unique unity of citizens' efforts. It was called Icy February, but professional divers appeared who began to dive and get these documents out of the water. It was decided to unload the documents in a large yacht hangar, and this is how it looked. The journalists came in large numbers there. Most of them actually left a few hours after surfing through wet folders, but around a dozen of investigative journalists from absolutely different teams decided to stay, and I was lucky to be one of them. We decided that we have to save the documents, to dry them, analyze them, and make them public. But because they were wet, and it was a lot of them, we decided to move to another building on site from this hangar and to dry and sort out the documents. So what we did, we have publicly asked for the people's help. And absolutely regular people were driving to Mezhigirya. It's like 50 minutes drive from Kiev with scanners, laptops, dryers to help us speed up this process. And this is how the work of these volunteers and journalists and activists, just regular people, looked like together in the house of an escaped dictator. Somebody even brought an industrial dryer from one of the state libraries. It also was fun to dry documents in Yanukovych sauna. This is how it looked. Another funny moment, there was almost no internet at the residence. So I wrote on the Facebook that we need to start uploading documents to make them publicly available as soon as possible. And in the next hours, a man, owner of a telecommunication business, arrived on a van and brought us a satellite. Our work was also supported by the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, by Friedrich, who is on our panel today. He was also directly involved in this. So it was the OCCRP programmers who helped us very quickly create the website, to which we uploaded all the saved, preserved, and scanned documents. Navigation through thousands of documents were implemented, and a text recognition, which was also a very important tool, was integrated. And all this happened in a very short time. After 1 week of work, we were done. And actually, prosecutors took away all the archive that we saved. It was an evidence for future official investigation. What was in the documents and why it was so important to preserve and publish them? In the documents, we discovered a wide range of incriminating facts, handwritten checks for bribes, for example, schemes of Yanukovych inner circle corrupted business, even blacklists of journalists and activists who were under control and state surveillance, as it appeared to be. These documents actually made it clear how the whole Yanukovych corrupted empire worked. Firstly, it shed light on how money was coming to Yanukovych's surroundings. We found evidence of bribes in millions of dollars. For example, at this slide, you see a handwritten receipt that certain Alexander brought in $12 million in cash. So oligarchs and businessmen had to share their income with the president's family, and now it was known to the public. Secondly, Yanukovych leaks shed light on how and on what he was spending tremendous corrupted income. His residence was literally built in gold and diamonds. Chandeliers in his house costed overall $30 million. And these checks and proofs for this we found in the documents. It was all financial documentation for building up his residence, including spa complex, food laboratory, garage with vintage cars, and even a zoo inhabited by animals from around the world. After 1 week, we went home, and in the next week started to do our final stage of job, investigative journalism. And some of the files were saying everything for themselves, but some of them were just pointing on where to look further. So in 3 months, 12 journalists published in general 16 investigative stories. We were publishing them at Yanukovych Leaks website, but simultaneously on our native media outlets. I did it for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, for example. And many world key media outlets wrote about this project. Of course, the documents archive is still public. There was no other way. So many people were involved in saving documents. It was a moment of such transparency that it was no doubt whether it has to be public or not. And it was also changing in the government because of the revolution. So we wanted people in the new government to understand and to be reminded from this famous project and example that no matter how good you hide your wrongdoings, all the secrets may become public ones. After the revolution, we created a completely new project on Radio Svoboda, Radio Liberty. This is an investigative television program called Schemes, Corruption in Details. And it's been for 6 years already since we publish anti-corruption investigations on a weekly basis, on a regular basis. And due to such specifics, we created the system of a regular access, let's say, to close information. The system is built on our own network of whistleblowers, informants with access to closed databases. And such work requires a great care for your sources, for their protection from disclosure. But of course, there are leaks as well. People bring us USB drivers, archives, email dumps. Some of them are forming the basis of investigations, but in my experience, in practice, getting a leak is usually just the beginning of a long journey. To see social importance of information, to single it out, to check it, to compare it with the real events of the time, to find a presentation angle that will be interested for the people, this requires journalistic and editorial work. And here the question arises, is it always necessary to publish received data set in the full amount? I do not think so. And I hope we will have the further conversation today and discussion why I think so. But in the meantime, to conclude, let me remind you that the romance that surrounds journalistic investigations and the fight against corruption has also another side. For example, we regularly face the fact that our investigative figurants, the heroes of our stories, influence authorities, representatives from governmental or law enforcement sources or circles, or even oligarchs, try to hinder our work. In particular, access to our journalistic data, disclose our sources even, and control our activities. And just a few recent examples. 1 year ago, I woke up in the morning and read in the news that the court released a ruling which allows General Prosecutor's Office to access the information from my phone, from the cell phone operator. It was calls, SMS, my locations for the period of a year and a half, and it all should be exposed to the prosecutors, the court ruling said. I was a witness in one criminal case, but I think that was just an excuse, because before that happened, we conducted investigations, including about the general prosecutor himself. And I think I was thinking like, okay, now they will be able to track my contacts and therefore probably reveal my sources. But I was lucky that this case quickly gained a resonance. Together with lawyers, we fastly applied to European Court on Human Rights, and under the fast procedure, the court issued a decision that during the consideration of the case, the government was forbidden to receive and use information from my phone. And that was important victory, not my individual one, but also a precedent in the field of protecting journalistic rights and their sources' rights. One more short example, how exposing corruption may lead to a violation of a journalist's own privacy. This August, my colleague, journalist Mikhailo Tkach, found signs of wiretapping at his apartment. But since then, police investigation on this incident is not going anywhere. And finally, moreover, this summer, our team car was burned. It was a very important instrument for our work in the fields, and it was it was a direct arson attack. But the good story, which warms our hearts and minds, that people care and value investigative reporting. Because the next days after the arson attack, Ukrainians organized a donation campaign, and 500 people made their donations, and we got $10,000 within 1 week, and were able to buy another used car to continue our field work.
Thank you very much, Natalie. So I would like to ask you a question, and then we could pass the conversation to Jaromil's presentation. I found very interesting that in your presentation of the Yanukovych leaks, you really speak about this form of collective intelligence that is coming together. So was a collaboration between activists, journalists, and even divers that were inside the lake. So I think this was a very unique situation related to leaks. And I wanted to understand a bit more from you how this collaboration happened, how these people collaborated together, because I think that as part of our work, as you were also saying, it's very important to understand how the people can support each other, and also how different expertise could benefit from each other. So would you like to tell us a bit more of how this collaboration developed, and also if this leak contributed to provide a very strong change in the political system in Ukraine, and what is the situation today?
Sure. It started a big developments in the country together with the revolution outcome. But if we talk about the consequences of the Yanukovych Leaks project, there are several, I think. Personally, I think it's important that at that point, people in Ukraine realized how powerful investigative journalism can be. They began to take it really seriously, and many wanted to join to share this experience, to demonstrate their active citizen position. And the system of whistleblowing was also taken roots. And secondly, after the revolution, anti-corruption activists, together with investigative reporters, have done a lot to introduce much, much greater transparency in state and public affairs. Dozens of meetings in ministries, writing new laws, and Ukraine has opened its registries of property, real estate, company registries, and many, many more. They are almost all free. And in terms of access to information, Ukraine have become one of the most advanced countries in Europe. If we talk about Yanukovych, ex-president himself, he is suspected of high treason. He lives in Russia and he will be arrested once he arrives in Ukraine. Part of his corrupted property is in museums, part was confiscated and sold. As for Mezhigirya residence, it is still run by volunteers, and today it's one of the best public parks in Ukraine where special tours are conducted. So it has become a museum of corruption. And if you are in Ukraine, if you will be in Ukraine, I would highly recommend you visit it, because I think, and I'm sure that for kleptocrats, not only in Ukraine, but for corruptioners all over the world, this residence is a kind of a reminder that patience of the people is not infinite. And at one point, you can lose everything: power, money, and even freedom.
Thank you very much. Now I would pass the word to Jaromil, Denis Jaromil Roio. He's the co-founder of Dine.org and also CTO of the Decode project that works on blockchain technology and data ownership. And with this presentation, he will bring the importance of social movements and how they can challenge city policy on money speculation. So I leave the word to you, Jaromil, and welcome here.
Thanks, Tatiana. Thanks, everyone. I'm very honored to be here at Logan, being the audience through the years, to humbly share some of the experience we have matured at Dine.org. So first, a brief introduction. My organization is one of the many in the world today hacker community-based organizations. We exist since quite a while, mostly ham radio amateurs from the 90s, where are the elders of our network, and so on and so forth, with BBS, internet, and the worldwide sensation of hackers now. You can imagine what is our legacy. We do free and open source software, and we work mostly in public sector so far, producing platforms for digital and social innovation. And I'm here sharing with you a point of view that is not as mainstream as you can understand from the next slide. You can see that this is an image that was circulated online back some years ago that shows the interconnection between the effort that was WikiLeaks, led by Julian Assange, and an idealist and, in my opinion, a genius, Richard Stallman, that after founding the GNU project and the free software movement, guiding it through quite some praxis, quite some action, then embraced the cause of WikiLeaks. This is a far fetch. It's also like very much in our eyes, it's a mainstream representation of the hacker ethos. And I'd like to share with you a point of view that is a little bit more marginal. Let's say we are not playing with these big games, but also we are not within the context of US that we are operating. And well, in the next slide, you can also understand one of the points I'd like to make in my talk is that by actually moving into the scenario that I'm inviting you in, the European scenario, and in particular the Italian heritage of corruption, which also deserves a museum. I'm not sure we have one yet. You see that in the corporate and also in the government world, there is a long tradition of infiltration and actually fitting in. And this is one of the topics that I would like to bring to the attention. The fact that often the coolness of an institutional environment and the coolness of a corporate environment is not a problem for the corrupted people to infiltrate, but it is a barrier for social movements to actually act and to bring the innovation and the sort of action that was shown just before in one of the examples that we have now in Europe. So, well, in the next slide, please, you see that we have a heritage, and that's what I would like to present you. In Europe, we have an heritage that I can account for. This is a Sicilian initiative, and I bring it up because mafia, of course, is a televised corruption legacy. And in my own opinion, actually, all these TV series that have popularized it are not doing really a service to us that live into corruption and live the actual reality of what is corruption. But I don't want to talk about that now. I want just to present you the fact that there are people, there is a large part of civil society that us as hackers also at Dyne.org and with the FreakNet Brotherhood, we have helped to work. Journalists that have done this as a service to the community and have brought up also a culture of anti-mafia. Imagine how hard it is if you live in south of Italy with the main TV series being televised, giving people an image of mafia being a cool thing to do, giving the young people an image of mafia being just cool. How hard it is to work into these very places and to make a point saying that mafia kills society, people, and actually makes it very hard to live for honest people. And these movements have found historically their place in squats, in liminal places, in social places, in whatever space was not assigned, was perhaps left empty. The long tradition that we have in Italy of social centers has been the home for these movements. The practice of pirate radios or pirate televisions that are only neighborhood televisions are still nowadays the home for the real anti-mafia movements that come from bottom up. So you can imagine this, how asymmetric it is in terms of confronting a worldwide hype sometimes that is mafia practices, and on the other side working outside of the institutions, often being fought by the institutions, being evicted, and still carrying on with a smile, as Riccardo Rioles does in this image. He is one of the last people that survived, actually. Peppino Impastato, Giuseppe Fava, they've all been killed by mafia as journalists. And we carry on nowadays with a new magazine. The original one was called I Siciliani, but now also to recognize the role of women that have in this history, it's called Le Siciliane. And well, with the next slide, I bring you up another example, another historical example that I think touches all Europe. In this case, we go to the Netherlands. This is it's one of these punk leaflets from a squat that I had the luck to participate into, a squatted vegan restaurant and social place, wegewinkel, as we say in the Netherlands, so giveaway shop. And hosting all these sort of activities, also hosted what is called the Kraksprekur, the place where if you want to squat in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, back then when it was a civil case, when it was possible to protect yourself with a lawyer for your actions. It was not a penal, a crime, a criminal persecution. Back then, this was a service for people, students, artists, single mothers, whoever didn't have the money to actually afford a place to live, to assist into squatting. What is this related with the fighting financial crime? It's because in a city like Amsterdam and many other cities of Europe, you can imagine financial speculations lands into the real estate market. And we had many places that were left empty, for instance, by criminals that couldn't go back to the Netherlands, by criminals that were even shot sometimes, they die by their own business, and people that basically bought places to keep them empty just to park and whitewash some money. And within the squatting movement in the Netherlands, but not only, we actually organized to research these places. We had a parallel cadastre, a small institution, an investigative private bureau called SPOC, Spekulantenonderzoek, research on speculators, that had a list of houses that in the city were left empty and the reasons why, so that we could present also dossier to lawyers and to the police itself when they asked what we were doing there. And on this, I can witness that really many of these actions actually helped to not only find out what speculation is about, but the most useful social service is to recover this sort of situation. And this is another topic that I like to pose to everyone's attention. After we have found the corruption, after we have entered a kleptocrat house, how are we going to reuse this sort of infrastructure? How we are going to make it social again, to socialize it and to make it useful. So next slide. Now I make my point by a little bit humbling this sort of vision. So far, acting in this way, we have been Don Quixotes. The big business has been barely scratched by the efforts of civil society nowadays in terms of going against their huge power and again their very high skills in infiltrating an institutional environment and a corporate environment that often does not looks at inclusion, just looks at exclusion with its own policies. Europe itself has to reconsider a lot of the policies, and cities and nations have to reconsider a lot of the policies that have been done in the last 10 years on the wave of a neoliberalist change in governance, because they have been excluding people, excluding on the basis of perhaps data analysis, and perhaps in the future of deploying all sorts of more technological and even artificial intelligence driven measures to actually data mine what happens. But all these measures are technical and they have been shown in history that can be infiltrated. The corruption can comply with the system much more than civil society does. And with the next slide, I just point out at some of the efforts that we had the luck to contribute to at DINE and that the European Commission brought forward in the last years. Projects like this, Common Fair, tried to actually leverage the stories from the bottom up of the neighborhoods and the cities to actually understand what was going on. But not only, we also deployed a complementary currency system that could actually quantify the flows, the financial flows that were passing in our own situations. So social centers have been adopted practices of radical transparency in the way it was flowing the money through the situations, and starting to look and demonstrate how participatory budgeting can be done also in a social condition. This because really to change the world, we have to walk the walk and practice a sort of transparency ourselves. In this case, we deployed blockchain technology also to make private the sort of identities that were shown by transactions within a social center, but to show the volume and to prove the actual practices and the volume of money that was going through in these operations. In the next slide, and the last one, you will see that there was a larger cluster of projects that unfortunately has lost recently, in the last years, progressively lost money for funding and research. The cluster of social awareness, social innovation, social entrepreneurship in Europe is losing grip to a technocracy that invests more and more into bare technologies. And I believe, as a technologist myself, that just investing in technology will not lead in the inclusion of civil society. We need to lead forward with efforts that put also social activity and interdisciplinarity as a methodology on the table. We had experienced this in some of the projects in the past, but I must witness also as an active researcher for the European Commission that the projects in this regard are getting less and less. Whether this is a political or scientific choice, I leave it up to you. But I hope that in Europe we will see more consciousness in understanding what is the role of civil society and more inclusion of civil society at the table, where so far I have seen mostly only corporate and institutional presence that barely can envision a policy that is inclusive for this sort of efforts. So I hope really to live in a better place, and I leave it to you now.
Thank you very much, Jaromil. Also, being Italian myself, I really appreciated that you spoke about the strong act of anti-corruption that are also done in Italy through history. And then I would like to connect to an Italian scenario that recently was very much discussed also in the media, that also involved you, because together with a group of people, you recently launched the platform Open Rousseau, that was connecting the free software and open source movement to the act of digital sovereignty, trying also to influence the context of policy making and at the same time to fight corruption with more transparency. And I think this is a really good example so how the collectivity could interfere with the policy making in a very positive way and also provide a change. So I would like to ask you if you could tell us a bit more about the Open Rousseau project and what you did.
Thanks, Tatiana. Open Rousseau is a rather technical intervention, but I like to share with you the vision behind. Basically, in Italy, we have some pioneering movements, political movements that have adopted participatory democracy tools and practices to actually have a bottom-up approach to governance. The problem with these movements that are not unique to Italy, we have them in all Europe, is that many times their technology is not open source. Their processes are not as transparent as they need to be. And I really agree with Natalia when she shows us the fact that transparency and access to data is very important. Also, not only to fight corruption, but to establish a sustainable governmentality for our society, meaning that we need to use free and open source tools to actually prove that the decisions that we are declaring as being taken democratic are really taken in that way. We need a scientific approach that actually makes provable many of the processes that are incrementally done by technological means in government. And this is lacking, from the very buttons that are in a parliament to the future systems that allow people perhaps to express a preference from remote. And I believe that if we do not approach these things with an open and transparent approach to technology, we have a problem. That's simply what we are trying to do. We made headlines because we pointed out the parties that are not using free and open source software for their decisions. We pointed out flaws in these processes, and in a collective way, we started mapping and gathering a community of people that like to practice participatory democracy, participatory budgeting, and all these sorts of things at all levels. The experience I'm bringing in is that one of research we have done in Europe, in Spain, in Iceland, and in many other places. And so we are ready to say the technology is there. And for those politicians and those movements that want to adopt it, please be honest and use an open approach, use free and open source software, and make transparent your processes.
Thank you, Jaromil. And now we pass to Friedrich Lindenberg. And I think this is a very interesting transition because I know that Friedrich is working with a lot of projects related to large scale data sets that also work with anti-corruption, and they monitor organized crime. And of course, by being the data team lead at OCCRP, you constantly work with these big data sets and trying to understand also how to deal with sensitive data. So we are really curious also to know from you how is the approach that you are developing, and also listening through different projects that you have been working together with your team recently.
It's actually very, very interesting for me to hear, Jaromil, because I come from a background of looking into participative technology and how it can function to enable more participation. And over the years, I've grown more and more almost pessimistic in my outlook. And at this point, I just kind of want to create more means for those who are without power to keep those who do have power to account. And I think that's where my presentation sets in. It also addresses what you spoke about a little bit with regards to the notion of the threat that people who do look into organized crime face, and with the particular phenomenon of journalist murders. So the story I wanted to talk about today has its starting point in February of 2018. When a couple of 27-year-olds, Jan Kuciak and Martina Kushnerova, both Slovak citizens, were found assassinated in their own home outside of Bratislava. Jan Kuciak was an investigative reporter working for a Slovak media outlet, and he'd been writing extensively about the role of organized crime in the country. What was interesting is that his murder did not go unnoticed in the country. It was not one of those that end up on page 3 in the newspaper, but instead it caused a large protest. It caused a change of government within, I think, almost a week. It caused a movement to form within Slovakia that felt that the connections between political power and organized crime in the country had gotten too dense, and that impunity was no longer an option. This has been carrying on to this day. I think just last week, many senior police officers in Slovakia were arrested overnight. And so until today, there's this kind of almost lesser revolution. I wouldn't compare it to the Yanukovych situation, but there's been this kind of movement to say, okay, enough is enough. We must go from this kind of kleptocracy towards a proper democracy. So my colleagues in Slovakia and Czech Republic soon started to investigate this. One of the principles we have at OCCRP is that when a journalist gets assassinated or gets murdered, we can never let their story die. That is the idea of killing a journalist, and it can never succeed. And so whenever we see the murder of a journalist in our network, we try to double down on it and finish up all of their stories, and really kind of try and find who's behind it. And so at first, actually, we thought that the background to the murder of Kuciak might have been related to Italian mafia, to 'Ndrangheta, which is also now active in Slovakia. But it soon turned out that actually behind the assassination was a network connected to a Slovak businessman, Marian Kočner. He was a power broker in the country. He traded compromat and had a network that included many judges, prosecutors, police chiefs, and politicians in the country. It was eventually alleged in court that he had commissioned a murder for 70,000 euros to kill Yanukovych and also his fiancée. What happened next is where kind of this becomes more of a leak story, which is that my colleagues in Slovakia received access to the police file for the Kuciak case. Now, when you think about a police file, traditionally, I think you imagine probably something like this, right? Like a little manila folder that has some material on the investigation. That's not the situation that we found ourselves facing in this case. Instead, what we ended up with was a massive trove of data. And maybe on the next slide, you can see this is 60 terabytes of data in a backpack. The entire thing is filled with hard drives and one change of clothes for me. Basically, we ended up with everything that Slovak police had collected over the year and a half that they'd been investigating the murders of Kuciak and Kushnarova. This included CCTV police footage from the village and from many other places, phone recordings, bank records, satellite imagery, and most interestingly, it included the phones, tablets, and computer drives of all of the suspects in the case that had been seized by the police and basically forensically archived. What I found interesting from a kind of technical point of view, and I'm a technologist, was just how quickly this changed nature, right? Like when we normally deal with the leak, we think about it as being someone's email inbox, and then you put it on mega upload, and there it goes. But that wasn't possible with this. You can see it's actually a physical artifact, and it's a hard thing to get a handle on that much data. And so we were basically faced with a number of problems. One is like, how do you acquire 60 terabytes of data? We had the source who wanted to provide us this data, but we didn't actually have the material yet. Second, how can we let reporters access this material, right? Like our idea in principle was relatively similar to the Yanukovych leak situation, which was that we wanted to create this process of national accountability, right? This mechanism by which as many reporters as possible could access the material. But also we had to realize that this was an ongoing court case, and that publishing the wrong material or too much of the material could actually lead to a mistrial and thereby undermine the exact type of accountability that we had been after. There was also a lot of actual compromat in there. So basically, these are information weapons, right? And kind of setting them free to the wrong party wouldn't have improved matters in Slovakia at all. And finally, we had this problem of how do we actually systematize all this material? Because, as I mentioned, it's a lot of material, but it's collected by police logic, and it's not organized in terms of a journalistic inquiry. And so in terms of addressing the first problem, we actually ended up building a machine. Because it turns out that if I were to just go there with my laptop and copy all the data, it would have taken a month, and I did not want to move to Slovakia for a month. So what we ended up doing was actually to build this little contraption that contained 10 Raspberry Pi computers, all open source, of course, that we then used to copy all the data in parallel. And we set up this massive kind of rig. Unfortunately, I can't show you how we copied it at the source. This is our office in Berlin. We basically tried to receive as much of the material as possible, and then we started to kind of clean it up and unpack it and get access to the material therein. And when police basically seizes your computer, what they do is they make a binary image of your hard drive. That's actually something that is like a virtual computer. We then had to kind of draw out of these virtual computers all the files and documents and chat histories and browser histories and all the interesting kind of evidence that could be found in there. In a way, kind of the process of transforming from data to evidence. So eventually we ended up with this kind of library that you can see here, which is organized by the suspect and by what kind of device had been seized. And we eventually also ended up cleaning up a lot of the material that wasn't relevant to our reporting, either because it was kind of system data, or because it was, for example, private photography. And so we ended up kind of building this system that had all the information in it. Now the question became, how do we actually provide access to reporters to this material? And there we wanted to make sure that there was a controlled process of access, that rather than just kind of putting this on the internet, we wanted to have a very well-defined step-by-step process for how a reporter would get access to the material and what kind of terms of ethics they would have to agree to, but also of how, for example, they could extract parts of it that they would then use further in their reporting or publish as evidence in their actual writing. And so we ended up having a very pre-COVID solution to this problem, which was that we actually set up a room, which was dubbed Koczler's Library, given that all of his computers were in there. And basically we invited about a dozen Slovak media to participate in Koczler's library and to visit this small office where we'd set up a number of kind of protected laptops that would be able to access the material remotely and browse it and kind of find interesting bits and pieces. This room kind of went in conjunction with kind of a broader project to kind of coordinate also who would be working on what leads, develop them, really turn them into stories. As Natalie mentioned at the beginning, the data can only ever be a starting point, right? Or it can be a final little connection between two things that you already suspected, but it can never be the whole story. And so we also ended up kind of trying to get as many of the Slovak media who were working on these on the story to collaborate with each other. Basically, the outcome of this is a mixed bag, I would say. As I said, until today, there's been police arrests, there's been raids based on material that comes out of this trove. But at the same time, the court eventually found that they could convict the 3 people who actually were at the site to murder Jan and his fiancée, but they did not find sufficient evidence to find Koczler guilty of the assassination. Basically, there was not that one sentence that would really put him behind bars. Frustrating, but I guess that is in itself the rule of law at work. So in the end, it's a result that we have to live with, and maybe future evidence will surface. But like the long-term strategy of this is something that I also want to talk about, which is that we've been collecting leaks. Actually, we've been working on a software that is a very, very, very remote descendant of the Yanukovych documents system called Aleph. And basically, the idea is that we're kind of putting together as much evidence from different phases as we can. The fundamental idea being that journalism needs to have a memory, right? Like we cannot always become obsessed about the latest and greatest piece of information, but rather we need to kind of really thread together the threads, even if they show up a few years apart. And so that's why we've been building this archive. It's grown from, I guess, 1 leak, Yanukovych leaks, to now about 200 or so leaked datasets in it. And it's also where more and more of the Koczler library is now ending up, so that reporters can more flexibly access it and can use it in their reporting. One thing that's interesting about this is, like, the more we've been working on this, the more closed it's actually become. The more we've decided this is actually a powerful instrument for investigative journalists to have, and it really enables us in the work we do. But it's not a thing that we want anyone to have access to for data privacy reasons, for protection reasons, and also because it just gets freaky when you collect all of this information. We've basically moved towards a model where journalists have to essentially get accredited in order to have access to the archive. We basically ask that they prove that they go, for example, through a fact-checking process on their stories before it gets published, whether it's online or on some other media. And our goal with that really is to kind of build something that's a long-term leak mechanism, right? I think I have a tremendous amount of respect both for the work that WikiLeaks has done, especially when it was focused on these smaller kind of stories, Julius Baer, the Kenyan elections, etc. And I have a tremendous amount of respect, obviously, for Edward Snowden. But I think what we're trying to do is to also build something that isn't going to flame out anytime soon, but that rather kind of creates a sustainable infrastructure for investigative reporting that we can kind of turn into a core working component of our industry. And so that's, I think, what we've kind of learned is that while transparency is a goal, in many cases there's a lot of pragmatic benefit to targeted privacy, or to managing who has access to what information. Do they have a reasonable need for it? Do they have a reasonable perspective towards analyzing it in the public good, in the public interest? Yes. So that's the idea behind Aleph, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Friedrich. So I would like to ask you a question as well, and follow up a bit with this idea that you just mentioned related to the concept of transparency, and also the limitation of transparency as a method. Of course, in the context of investigation of organized crime and corruption, is understandable that you have also to protect data privacy. But how could you still provide a certain level of involvement of the civic society? Because in what you were saying, there are methodology of involving journalists, but what about, for example, the civil society or even the social movements that, for example, Jaromil was referring to? How can we still create this openness and at the same time also have a certain level of secrecy that is important, as you say?
Definitely. I mean, I'm really interested in finding this balance. If I had a final answer for you, that would be fantastic. I don't. One thing that we're doing is we're producing this platform, this data analysis platform, also as open source software. So there's actually a number of civil society organizations that have adopted the same software we're using, and they're putting their information into it, so that they basically then build their own corpus of information. We've also been working with certain activist groups to kind of provide them somewhat increased access to the material, basically material that does not threaten a source or does not have a special kind of threat risk associated with it, that we sometimes make available to activists. But I think there's also a larger point around trust, right? Like, I think one thing that I've observed around leaks is that we become fascinated with the rawness of evidence, and that basically it becomes almost a tokenistic thing. I think you could see that a little bit in the run-up to the U.S. election around the discussion around Hunter Biden and his laptop, right? Where the whole question of a leak kind of became the story rather than anything in it, and also the question of like whether you can actually use a leak as a political instrument, which obviously you can. And so I think kind of in a way, what I feel is a hopeless effort is to try and replace trust in media and in basically the articles that we publish, where we do provide evidence, with a trust in raw data. I think that's an instinct that comes with the internet in some way, but I don't actually think it works out in practice. It doesn't actually create better trust. It just creates like more chaos and more opportunity for disinformation.
Thank you. And I think now is also the time to open the discussion among all of us. And I would like to connect exactly to this last point that you did, and trying to reflect together about this dilemma of protecting data if they need to be protected, related to data privacy, for example, and also instead trying to create a process that is more inclusive for the civil society. And also Natalie was asking during her presentation if it's always necessary to publish data in full amounts, while Jaromil was saying that it's very important to provide transparency, involve the social movement to act, and also reflect on the infrastructure that we create to enable this. So I think it's a dilemma that is probably very difficult to solve, and maybe there is not just one answer, but I think it would be important also among us to describe some best practices, because I think in certain cases it's probably more important to follow a certain way to deal with that, and the other there is the opposite direction. So I would like to understand what you think about that, and extend the question that I asked to Friedrich also to Natalie and Jaromil.
Well, actually, as I mentioned previously, in Ukraine, we have a very transparent system of access to public information, and sometimes even it is surprises other representatives from other countries. For example, it is absolutely easy to find a property of a person having just the name and a surname and a date of birth. So you will easily get full information on the property he owns, the person owns, like until the apartment number. So it's really a big transparency which was implemented 6 years ago, and we didn't see like really bad sides of such transparency. There was no such results. But if we talk whether the leaked data sets should be public or not, I think it really depends on the situation itself, and I agree a lot with Friedrich how they are doing this their approach in OCCRP. But I will answer from my own perspective as a practical side of investigative journalism work. Balancing the right between privacy and the public importance of information is a permanent dilemma for us investigative journalists. We face it almost every day on every material that we work on. Sometimes the decision is obvious. For example, when we received the dump of an emails of the Ukrainian corrupted judge, and it contains a lot of private information, private photos, private communications. So it's really necessary, of course, to separate really socially important documents from it. For example, in such dump, we found an evidence that one of Ukrainian corrupt judge owns a property throughout the world. And we didn't even publish not a single email. We just checked this information from property registers of those countries that we know already the property exists there. We filmed this property and released as a complete story without even saying that it was coming from an email dump. Or another example, we received telephone conversations of ex-president Poroshenko's close ally. It was hundreds of hours of phone talks about complicated corruption schemes. But to use it into publication, it's needed to be understood what they're talking about, to be processed without the work of journalists and analytics editors. I think it would be impossible. And all the talks should not be published in this case. It just makes no sense. But of course, when we talk about different type of leaks, such as let's say offshore country database, then it's completely different. But even here, I want to say two things which I think is important to keep in mind. First, what's matter for journalists, it's exclusiveness. When we talk about investigative corruption, money laundering, crime, then let's be honest, exclusivity really matters. If I am, as an investigative reporter, will be approached by the source who says, here I have a data set which never was published, and it never was analyzed before, or I will be approached by, let's say, a big reputable network of investigative reporters who has data and invite us to collaborate with them. These type, of course, we will pay much more attention to these type of data sets and leaks than those that are already published somewhere on the internet and easily accessible to anybody on the net. And that's the nature of investigative reporters. We compete for our stories. And the second thing that was already mentioned by Friedrich is trust. In the world full of anonymous Telegram channels, very popular in our country, for example, websites with gigabytes of leaked documents, people are just lost. There should be a reputation of a media, of a reporter, of a digital activist group applied to every important data set, because people will believe it more if they trust to those who stand behind the leak publication?
I can give a perspective that is shifting a bit. I work as a applied cryptographer since more than 10 years now, and my role within institutions is mostly policy advisory. So I'm not a practitioner in case of journalism, but I think that the question affects a lot of policymakers, and nowadays it becomes very important to put it in focus. Also, with regards to the COVID emergency, which has tramped a lot of privacy rights. I believe that to put a framework, we have first to put a framework in place to really debate on the importance of private data and transparency. And the best one that I know of is the one elaborated by Helen Nissenbaum. She named it the contextual integrity principle. So when we have privacy and we define data, then we have to accept that this is a moving ground, just as an ethical point of view can be within different contexts, and we have to be ready to adapt it to a context and to keep it integral to a context. Say that, I know it's pretty abstract. I want to say basically that radical transparency is not really a solution. It can be a shock therapy in a certain situation, but it's not sustainable because it doesn't provide a level of privacy that makes also a sustainable protection for people that can be persecuted on behalf of personal or skewed agendas. Therefore, I believe that in the moment in which we have to adapt a context of data minimization or privacy according to certain rules that can be changing even from state to state, even within Europe, it's very important that policymakers have a clear look into the technology that is adopted. And with this, I want to say that automatizing certain processes is a very dangerous approach when you do not know exactly what is automatizing them. When you outsource it to a private company that actually automatized the data mining on behalf of your own goal, providing you answers based on artificial intelligence analysis, for instance, or deep learning or whatever. When you do not have an exact understanding on what is done with this data, then there can be other agendas skewing in. And I like to be very pragmatical. So I conclude with one effort that we are leading at DINE and with the Decode flagship project we worked on for the European Commission in the last years, is to make code understandable by people that do not code, and especially code that manipulates data. So we produce free and open source software called Zenroom, and through the use of Zen code, what we call human-like language, data can be concealed and also opened up in a very granular way. And I believe that this is very important also with regards to the innovation that cryptography has seen in the last 10 years. The world of cryptography has been evolving a lot. It's not only used to sign and to enclose documents. And we can do a lot more now, and we need to put it in place into a process that is not governed just by technicians, but also by civil society and politics ultimately.
That's an interesting perspective.
Yes, I would like to ask you to comment this, and then we can wrap it up.
At the risk of getting a little bit off the main topic of the conversation, I think one thing that worries me most about this perspective of how do we make sure that politics remains in control of regulating technology is actually financial matters. So OCCRP does a lot of investigations into money laundering, into financial malpractice. And if you think about what is the ultimate mechanism for financial crime, it's a mechanism of transferring money that has no government that can regulate or stop it, i.e. a blockchain, right? And so I'm actually very, very interested in the fact that we are extremely excited about this idea of building technology that almost by definition cannot be regulated, except with actual house rates, and how that kind of might threaten basically democratic governance on some level as well.
Jaromil, would you like to answer to this?
Yeah, I can. I believe it's a good concern. I don't believe that much in regulation. I believe in design. And I believe that the research and development agenda needs to be driven by civil society. That's why I say that politics need to be on top. In the moment in which we have a multinational company that has no jurisdiction and profit only as a goal, then of course we will see that technologies that are fundamentally anti-social, they will be funded to disrupt in the way you're mentioning. Financial capitals can float around the world and be used by speculation and even as reserves for money laundering. It's all about what we choose to develop with. Blockchain technology itself allows a great level of tracking if engineered in a certain way. It allows also selective disclosure of certain parts of data. But it depends what we develop it for. I've been involved in many of these developments, and I know that the struggle, in particular with distributed ledger technology, was to make it pseudonymical. And even today, it's hardly anonymous. So, per se, a ledger technology is not really enhancing is not enhancing privacy, but transparency. But again, it's just like every technology, it depends what we want to use it for. It goes from the example typical of a knife or that of atomic energy. And I think that I don't have any better suggestion than to make it understandable by more people, because I'm afraid, at least from what I see in Europe, that in a very good faith, politicians, policymakers, and technicians work towards making a system that is still very easy to permeate by corruption, because they exclude instead of including. And so what I'm suggesting is that we have inclusion, and that is not only done by opening doors, but also by developing systems that are intelligible by more people. And we will see this is a challenge in the coming years, because technology is growing in its complexity and usefulness. So how do we tame this in order to still keep it a democratic growth, democratic and social innovation?
Thank you, Jaromil. I see that we have just 2 minutes left. Natalie, would you like to comment this last part of the discourse by Jaromil, also trying to understand how it's possible to involve the civic society by reflecting on more democratic methods related to providing accessibility to information and data? For example, speaking about your own practice.
Sure. No, I completely agree with my colleagues, but I just wanted shortly to say that our cooperation between with programmers, with civil activists, it really was the reason why we succeeded a lot in our fight for governmental transparency.
Yes, and I think this connects to the discourse of trust as well that was brought into the discussion, because I believe that by also protecting data privacy, we still have also to trust the civic society to be able to understand certain data. So I would like to conclude also this conversation by saying that perhaps we should reflect on methods that are inclusive to involve the civil society by also trusting the people. And at the same time, this requires that there is a collective work on technology and also the infrastructure that we are creating. So I would like to thank all the speakers that were with us today, and also the CIJ Logan Symposium that hosted us. And thanks a lot everybody for being with us. And also thank you from the production from Berlin for doing this great work, and the work that has been done in these days at the CIJ Logan Symposium. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.